Okay, Business 101 students, today we're going to be jumping into Chapter 1, which sets the foundation for the entire class. So we're going to be talking about very basic economic concepts, all of the things that tie into a fundamental understanding of what business is all about. So let's jump in. Guys, before you forget, this week you have an assignment that seems a little outside of our business education, and that is to set up a LinkedIn page. You're going to have an assignment this week to create or to edit your LinkedIn page. If you've already got a LinkedIn, that's fantastic. It's a social network that essentially enables you to connect and to network with business professionals. It's great for getting a job. It's great for developing your career or building professional networks. Don't forget to take on that assignment this week. You'll see it in our week 1 module on Canvas to be able to get ready to start that process. So what is this chapter all about? What we're going to be talking about is how nonprofit and for-profit businesses work, what the environments of business are. We're going to be talking about the economic systems in the world and how they work. So we're talking about capitalism, communism, and even socialism. We're also going to be talking about different types of economic growth plus recessions. People have this idea that a recession is the end of the world. In reality, a recession is a natural part of the economy growing and changing over time. So is inflation. We're also going to be talking about how the government uses fiscal and monetary policy to be able to help manage our economic growth, and also how we fund these types of activities. We're also going to be talking about supply and demand with the economy, how markets actually work, and setting up the idea of what trends are affecting the way our economies grow and change. So we're going to be starting off by talking about the idea of revenue, the idea of cost and profit, what the factors of productions are, and what entrepreneurs are all about. We'll be occasionally checking in to make sure you understand these key concepts as well. Since we are at the beginning of our journey in terms of our exploration of the world of business, we're going to start off with the very basics. If you provide goods or services, usually with the intention of making money, you probably have a business. There are nonprofit businesses as well. For example, St. Francis University is a nonprofit business, and we're in the service industry providing education. People who make businesses or create businesses create either goods or services. Goods are things that we can buy. They're things that have physical value that we can touch, feel, or interact with. And then we get into services, which are things that companies do for other people. And the lines are getting blurrier all the time. If I ask for a show of hands, if we were in an actual classroom, how many of you have an iPhone? Many of you would raise your hands. And I would ask you if Apple was involved in the goods or services industry. In reality, they do both. Apple sells devices, but they also sell service plans. They sell mobile apps and even data services for backup. So the lines are getting blurrier as technology becomes a bigger part of the economy. That's part of the natural transition in business. So what are nonprofit organizations? They're groups who have missions that are not necessarily to make money, but to support other people. Sometimes they're services such as healthcare or educational institutions, for example, where companies are responsible to shareholders. For-profit companies, rather, are responsible to shareholders, people who actually fund the company through investing in them. The responsibility of nonprofits is to constituents. We might even call them stakeholders, not shareholders. What's different about working for a nonprofit? Generally speaking, if you work in the nonprofit world, you probably won't make as much money. You probably will be dealing with less well-funded resources such as marketing or other kinds of resources. You're dependent more on donations. You might make less money, but it might be a cause you're very passionate about. You might be making a big difference in the world. Now, that being said, that's not to say that for-profit companies can't be forces for good as well. It just means that the mission of the non-for-profit company more often than not tends to be philanthropic or service-oriented, for example. So what's the difference between revenue and profit? We can say that a company has amazing revenues for the year, but still isn't turning a profit. So what's the difference? Revenue means all the money you are bringing in. If you are Uber or Lyft, you're making a killing in terms of revenue. Profit becomes the problem. After you pay all your expenses, have you made money or not? Well, these days, if you're Uber or Lyft, maybe not. If you're operating at a loss, you've lost money after you've paid for everything. Some of the biggest and most influential companies in the world, Uber, Lyft, all of these new tech companies, a lot of them are not making money. Even Amazon, for its first decade of existence, was not profitable. Why is that? Because we were investing in new technologies and new ideas. So plenty of big name companies are still operating at a loss. So when we talk about taking risks in business, generally speaking, big risks equal big rewards. The higher your risk, if you're smart, the higher your potential reward. You're taking that risk for a reason. And again, we mentioned companies like Uber and Lyft that are taking risks, promising repeatedly they're going to be profitable, and that are not profitable. We're going to talk about how the Post-it note was a risk that turned into a reward, and the concept of entrepreneurs. That'll come a little later in the chapter, but remember the Post-it note because it was not an immediate success. Something that came out of failure, something that came out of taking a risk, could be a success in an entirely different form later on. Well, no matter what kind of business you are, if you are in the process of goods or services, you've got factors of production. All countries have these 5 factors to some extent, some in greater numbers of other. Land and natural resources means, do you have raw materials? Do you have water? Do you have wood? Do you have things to make steel? Do you have chemicals? Do you have rare earth elements to make cell phones? What are your natural resources? Labor. Do you have an available workforce? Are they young enough to do physical labor, or are they skilled enough to be able to do more technology kinds of labor? Capital. Do you have money to invest? Entrepreneurship. Do you have people who have good ideas who are willing to take a risk? And knowledge. Do you have the knowledge to make new products or services? Let's compare. If you're in the United States, we've got vast swaths of natural resources in the form of big parts of land, big pieces of land. We have large amounts of natural resources, for example. And we also have a lot of agricultural tillable soil. Labor. We've got a readily available workforce that's somewhat young. Capital. There are plenty of sources of investment here in the United States. We get lots of good ideas in terms of entrepreneurship and knowledge as well. Let's compare our scenario to Japan. Japan has all of these things as well, but where they're lacking is land and natural resources. They've got very little in terms of natural tillable resources. They have to import a lot of food. They don't have a lot of large reserves of petroleum or coal, so they have to make nuclear energy. So they've got different challenges than we do. And as a result, we're able to sell and connect commerce between countries to be able to get what we need. In the 21st century, entrepreneurship and knowledge are arguably just as important as the others. So having those resources, we also are lucky in the United States to have entrepreneurs, people who have great ideas for a new business and don't want to work for somebody else. Now, in a later chapter, we'll be comparing what an entrepreneur is versus a small business owner. If you inherit a pizza shop from your grandfather or your father or your mother, you might be a small business person, but not necessarily an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is somebody who comes up with a new idea or improves on an old one and takes a risk. That's not negating the value of small business. It just means it's a little bit of a different designation. If you're an entrepreneur, you better be independent. You better be creative. You have to make good decisions. You have to rely on yourself. There's going to be a lot of long, dark nights and early mornings, sometimes without very much reward. You've got to have resilience. You got to be able to have what they used to refer to as stick-to-itiveness to be able to make it as an entrepreneur. And most of all, you need to be able to carry your idea through and believe in it and be willing to fail. If we look at some of the biggest entrepreneurs in history, Henry Ford and Walt Disney both had multiple failures before they had successes. In fact, the newspaper that Walt Disney worked at once told him he lacked creativity. And he founded the most successful entertainment company at this point in the world. So people who are entrepreneurs who work for other people are intrapreneurs. Intrapreneurs create within companies. So what might be an advantage of being an intrapreneur? If I'm an entrepreneur, a typical entrepreneur, I got to come up with my own funding. I got to come up with my own places to work, pay the rent for my factory. If I'm an intrapreneur, I can do cool creative stuff while I'm working for somebody else, getting benefits and having a stable job. So entrepreneurs are people who get to create. Now, what's the disadvantage of being an entrepreneur? If you're working for somebody else, chances are you're probably not going to get to reap all the benefits of your creation. Let me give you an example. The Big Mac, one of the most famous sandwiches in all of fast food history, was created by a McDonald's franchise owner just outside of Pittsburgh in the town of New Kensington. He came up with the idea of two patties, special sauce, pickles, and cheese, all on a sesame seed bun. I probably messed up part of that. 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, onions, pickles on a sesame seed bun. See, I still remember it. What he got from McDonald's for his trouble wasn't $1 million. He got a plaque on a wall for creating the biggest fast food sandwich of all time. So entrepreneurs don't deal with as much risk, but they also don't get much in the way of benefits either. We're going to be talking about the Post-it note in that regard as well. So let's review. We talked about the idea of revenue versus profit, the 5 factors of production, what entrepreneurs are all about. Well, we're going to be diving back in to some of the other environments. You know what, though? I realized I didn't tell you the story of the Post-it note. So we're going back to entrepreneur for a second. The guy who created the Post-it note was a guy named Spencer Silver. He was working for 3M. He came up with an adhesive that was intended to be a super glue, a super adhesive, and this was in the late 1960s. He couldn't get it right. The glue didn't work well. Well, one of his colleagues went to church and was always trying to put notes in his hymnal to be able to remind him what hymns to go to sing, and he didn't want to mark up his hymnal by putting any kinds of marks with a pen, so he was using this poor adhesive to put pieces of paper on his hymnal. Somebody got the idea to say, wow, we could sell this, and the Post-it note was born. It was born out of a mistake. It was born out of a mistake made by an entrepreneur, somebody working within a company who was trying to be creative. But let's continue. We're going to be talking about the business environments. This will also tie into an assignment that you're going to be doing. We're going to be talking the factors that affect businesses and what some of the effects of technology are. All of these are our environments of business. And we're going to talk about how all these work. You've got external and internal. So your technological environment, well, everybody's got broadband internet and a cell phone these days, which means we can do different types of business. We can have location-based e-commerce based on our phones, for example. The global environment, well, we have global trade, which means even if we live in the cold North America in January, February, we could still enjoy strawberries from Mexico because we have global trade. We have a competitive environment. For example, does our company have a lot of competitors or few competitors? If we're Nike, we've got Under Armour and Adidas nipping at our heels. If we are Tesla, there aren't a lot of other all-electric car companies out there. What about the social environment? Well, if I'm a cigarette company, it doesn't look too good for me on the social level. People don't really appreciate that stuff these days in terms of watching young people smoke. But if I am a company that makes vegan foods or artificial meats, I might be appealing to an increased amount of people who think that's an admirable social choice. Demographics. In the United States, we're getting older as a country. So if I am Adidas or Under Armour or New Balance, maybe I want to be making clothes and sneakers for older people as well. The political and legal environment. Is it tough for me to import things these days because of tariffs, because of trying to preserve more American jobs? And the economic environment. If we have a good, strong economy, more people might be making more types of purchases for things they don't really need, but they want. So the external environment is the world writ large. The internal environment are the people within our companies and within our ecosystem, such as our customers, who affect both of these things. So what might be examples of external parts of the environment? Well, the technology, for example, how it's proliferating through the world. We've got multiple generations. We've got 5 different generations in the workplace right now. We've got work environments that are changing because more single parents, more females in the work environment. A more globally connected workforce, and now we're dealing with the idea of pandemics. The pandemic over the last year or so has changed the way we do just about everything. And again, it's not all bad. It's given us opportunities as well. Internal environments are how we manage our companies. Are we responsive? Are we taking good care of our employees? How do we manage our intellectual property, which is arguably more important than anything these days, because so much of what we have as companies isn't physical anymore, it's digital. And how do we manage our talent? You know, we had a 4% unemployment rate, which basically means full employment, guys. Anybody who wants a job can have one. before the pandemic, and it was tough to recruit people, as opposed to after the pandemic when it's a little tougher to get a job, but it's getting back there. But you've got to grow and manage your talent as well. Which of these factors is the most important? Well, that depends on what kind of business you're in and what your beliefs are. If you are dealing with making cell phones, for example, international business is important to you. And the idea of being able to do business with foreign countries, because rare earth elements, the things that actually power our smartphones, mainly come from China and Africa. So you've got to be able to have ways to do that work. If you're a regional grocery store, your local environments may be more important. So in terms of the environments of business, I'm going to show you how to do the environments of business exercise, which is one of your assignments for this week as well. I'm asking you to tell me a positive and negative in each of these environments for a business. So what we're going to do, we're going to apply these to Starbucks. So Starbucks, in the economic environment, a positive is right now the economy is solid enough that people can afford $3 to $5 cups of coffee and coffee drinks. The economic downside of the current environment is we've got a lot of unemployed people who are deciding to make coffee at home to save money. So we've got enough people to still do business, but we're not going to be able to attract customers and demographics who've lost their jobs. What about the legal environment? Well, right now, the legal environment means it's really easy to set up a franchise just about anywhere because there are low barriers to entry. The flip side is we got to stay in compliance with things like CDC and local ordinances about COVID-19 to make sure that we are conducting a safe business. The technological environment, well, a lot of people use the Starbucks app to be able to buy their drinks, and that way they're making really frictionless payments for us. The downside to that particular environment is people who don't have good paying jobs, for example, may also not have credit cards or digital ways of conducting transactions, so they may not be able to buy from Starbucks using the app. The competitive environment, everybody knows our name, everybody loves Starbucks, but we got competition. Dunkin' Brands is really stepping up on us. In the social environment, well, we like to think we reinvest in our communities. In fact, we even give free college tuition to our employees, and that's true. They are providing free college tuition to employees, I think, who've been there for 2 years. The downside is on the social environment, a lot of people are saying, wow, are you sourcing your coffee ethically, or are you getting it from places that use child labor? The demographics, well, older people don't tend to want to pay large amounts for cups of coffee, so that's a downside. The good side is that younger people are starting to see coffee as a healthy alternative to soda. And again, the global environment, the good side is we're a globally recognized brand and everybody likes coffee. The challenge on the global side of things is that we also are seeing a looming coffee shortage, which means we may have trouble finding supplies of coffee for our business. That's an example of how you can do the environments of business exercise. All this stuff, guys, in terms of what comes into our lives creates a standard of living. What's a standard of living? It means what can you afford? For example, somebody who makes $50,000 a year in central Pennsylvania can afford a reasonably comfortable living. $50,000 a year is not going to afford you a great living in New York City. So we're not the highest paid country in the world by and large. Many countries have a better general pay rate for most citizens than we do. The difference is it's less expensive to live in the United States than other places. So we have a positive ratio of income versus expenses. Well, why is that? Well, a lot of other countries also have greater amounts of government-provided benefits. Now, let me give you an example. In the United States, if you earn $100,000 a year, you're actually taking home about $70,000 because you pay about $30,000 in taxes. The average person pays between 25 and 30% of their income in taxes. Nobody likes paying taxes. Here's the flip side. If you live in England, you're paying over half of your income out in taxes. So the person who makes $100,000 a year in the United States takes home $75,000. The person who makes the equivalent of $100,000 in England takes home about $50,000. And that means, yeah, you have less take home. But the flip side is you also get free health care. Which is better? Well, it depends what your beliefs are about personal well-being versus personal investment, how much money we should be taking home, and the accountability of the individual, and a variety of other things. But our standard of living is based on the idea of less government intervention. So who has the highest standard of living in the world? I'll give you a hint. It's not the United States. If you went by the World Economic Forum, they say that the highest standard of living in the world goes to Norway. And how do they come up with that? Well, they used something called the Social Progress Index, which basically said how many people are struggling to find food and shelter, what about life expectancy, and how about personal freedoms. In the 2019 survey, the most recent one I have access to, the U.S. came in 26, so we're not even in the top 10. This is a very subjective evaluation, and I don't think you should take this to the bank and say, well, we're obviously failing as a country. But it is good food for thought to say, wow, maybe there are areas we can do better, areas we in the United States can improve to be more like Norway, or not. It depends on your personal beliefs. Because your definition of quality of life is a highly subjective and highly individualized notion. For people of my generation, I was a Gen Xer, we tended to be a little more obsessed with wealth. Our parents, who were baby boomers, really wanted big houses and big cars. They were the part of the generation that was born after World War II who wanted the good life. As a result, my generation, Generation X, were called latchkey kids because all our parents did was work and get divorced. High divorce rates. And my generation had millennials. And millennials grew up sometimes in broken households with parents who were working all the time and wanted to have a better quality of life and better work-life balance. And then we get to Gen Z, who is thinking about all of these things and deciding, do I need that big house and big car, or do I want more experiences, vacations, and free time to enjoy my life? Not saying one is right or wrong. They're just different. So what are some demographic shifts we have right now? We have more women going to work and more single parents of both genders. What does that mean to employers? Well, it means employers need to come up with things like flexible schedules. We have more older individuals in the workplace, which means, for example, we might need to adapt things like technology. And by the way, some companies are actually actively recruiting older people because they have great work ethics. Why are so many older people still in the workforce? Well, in 2008, when the first financial crisis of the 21st century happened, a lot of people lost a substantial part of their income in their retirement in the markets and all of a sudden had to go back to work or kept working for healthcare. The United States is going to be a non-majority white country within the next 30 years. So we've got the fastest growing ethnicity based on demographics in the United States are people who identify as Hispanics. We're a more diverse country than we've ever been, and we're also integrating more with global industries more than ever. So we talked about the internal and external environments. We're talking about the shifts in demography. Let's get into what economic systems power the globe and what the differences are between these types of approaches. If you're talking about economics, we're simply looking at how money moves through an economy. Think about this. If an economy is the arteries and veins of a human body, the money is the blood that moves through it. So we're looking at how money moves through an economy. If you're looking at an entire country, you're going macro. Macro means big. You're looking at the quote-unquote 30,000-foot view. You're looking from the air. How does money move through the entire economy? Microeconomics is going a little bit more granular, a little deeper. How does money move through a state? How does money move through a city? For example, Johnstown, Pennsylvania has a higher unemployment rate than the national average. So if you live in Johnstown, you can have a pretty negative view on the economy when in reality the economy in the United States is recovering. So where you're at, your microeconomic view can shape your worldview as well, even when the clouds don't look so dark from higher up. So we have three basic economic systems: capitalism, communism, and socialism. Capitalism is known as a free market economy. It means that you as an individual can own a business, make money, and invest it yourself. It is basically the idea of liberty in the markets, very little regulation, very little oversight or control, and the incentive is the harder you work, generally speaking, the more money you can make. Communism is the polar opposite of capitalism. It means the government is making all economic decisions. The government owns all industries, or at least almost all of them, and you have very little individual incentive to excel or create because you can't own your creations or prosper anyway. And then you've got socialism, which is a little bit in the middle. In socialism, there are private businesses, and individuals may have entrepreneurial spirit and want to succeed, but large companies are often owned by the government. An example of a capitalist country, our best example, is the United States. You can start a business and make lots of money and be very successful. Communism, a great example of communism is North Korea, where literally everything is owned and controlled by the government. Why are there shortages of products and services all the time in communism? Because supply is determined by the government, not by consumer demand. And socialism is somewhere in the middle. Socialism, yeah, you might have some things that are produced by private companies, but you also might have, for example, the state owning major industries. Venezuela, for example, was a socialist economy powered by petroleum. The government owned most of the oil industry, the entire oil industry, which was great because when they were making money, when the price of oil was high, they were giving everybody lots of money from the government and subsidizing the prices of goods and services. What happened when oil tanked? Well, so did their economy, and inflation went crazy. All of a sudden, the main industry that was propping up all the other industries and owned by the government was no longer prosperous. In reality, we are all some level of mixed economy. In the United States, yes, we have capitalism, but we also pay taxes for roads. We have a free market that is also regulated. We have free pricing based on supply and demand, except for things like milk and bread, or not milk and bread, but milk and cigarettes, which have state minimum pricing, for example. So all economies, at some extent, are a little mixed. And these are, again, different examples of capitalism versus communism versus socialism. In reality, capitalism is growing faster than any other economic system. I am a free market capitalist. I make no bones about it, but I support you in having whatever opinion you think is correct. What are some other things that we should talk about? Well, state capitalism means that you have a government such as China, which might be communist, which is still allowing for some extent of a free market. So state capitalism means, yes, we have ultimately most businesses being owned by the government, but we're going to allow for some private big businesses, and we're going to allow people to build a middle class. The fastest growing middle class in the world is China. And then you've got a command economy. And that means the state is regularly intervening in the economy. For example, in China, the state often buys shares of stock in companies to artificially inflate the economy or manipulates the currency. So state capitalism is a command economy, but a command economy is not always state capitalism. So, for example, a pure communist government is also a command economy because they're intervening in the economy, but they're not always playing with capitalism. Capitalism itself is referred to as a free market economy. This diagram is freaking fantastic because it shows that the entire economy runs in a circle. You basically have people buying things from companies. And companies make things so people can buy them. The more things that companies make, the more natural resources they need. The more natural resources they buy, the more people that get jobs producing those natural resources. And people who are cutting down trees to make lumber to build homes, everybody in the chain makes money because they're adding value along the way. So the consumer buys and puts money back into that ecosystem, which supports itself. This is best illustrated by the fact that our economies are incredibly integrated. If we look back to the financial crisis of 2008, why did it happen? Well, a lot of people got loans to buy homes who maybe shouldn't have gotten loans to buy homes. And a lot of these folks couldn't make their payments. Well, when these folks quit making their payments on their homes, they went into bankruptcy, and the banks where they were paying their mortgages to weren't getting payments. So the banks weren't investing in other investments such as utilities and stocks and markets. And all of a sudden that money was drying up. So people in those industries who were being subsidized by banking investment weren't able to work. And all of a sudden everything grinds to a screeching halt because the consumer, who is ultimately king in this entire scenario, is no longer putting money back into the economy. So the economy came to a standstill. And in the United States, our greatest source of wealth is our homes. Why is that? Because number one, homes are expensive. And number two, they are perpetually a source of repair and needs of capital investment, which power large investments in the market because we buy refrigerators, air conditioners, and lumber to keep them up. Again, the cycle is perpetual. So in terms of expenses and revenues, revenues and expenses, I should say, where does our government get our money to spend? Well, mainly from taxing us. So almost half of our our revenue comes from, or the government's revenue comes from taxes, and also from payroll taxes, and also from corporation taxes, and taxes. Where do we spend all that stuff? Where do we spend all that money? Well, if you look at it, guys, we're spending about 15%, 16% on defense. A quarter of our tax dollars are spent on propping up Social Security. And guys, what's the problem? We have an aging country. We have fewer people who are coming into the workforce, more coming out. What does that mean? To keep Social Security operating, you got to put more taxes on the people who are working. And so Social Security, sooner or later, is not going to be able to sustain itself. Medicare, we're paying for a lot of people to have health care. And again, lots of other expenses. So the federal government's spending money in all kinds of places. So where do our taxes go? If you've enjoyed the services, for example, of a fire company, taxes. Our military, taxes. Police, taxes. If you've gotten free health care, taxes. A COVID-19 shot, taxes. Our taxes go into our public schools. Our taxes are spent in all kinds of ways. How you think taxes should be spent is a highly individualized question. Some people believe in lower taxes and fewer amounts of government services. Some people believe in higher taxes and more government services. And then there are the folks who want low taxes and lots of government services. How do you get that? You put your country into debt by borrowing money. So in terms of the economics, guys, we're going to be talking about all of this stuff. But let's get into how economics actually works. We're going to be talking about the business cycles of how a recession works and why it's not something that's the end of the world. First thing you need to understand, guys, we talked about blood moving through blood vessels. GDP stands for gross domestic product. And that means how much money is moving through an economy at any given time. At the time of this recording, our U.S. GDP was just over 20 trillion. That's trillion with a T. China is catching up with us. Our number 2 economy in the world used to be Japan. Now it's China, and they're at 14 trillion. They're catching us. So all this stuff, guys, goes through a cycle. There's nothing with a recession that indicates it's the end of the world. We have this happen. First, you have an economic boom, however. That's the first stage in any business cycle. Something big happened that got people investing. Whether it was the gold rush in California in the 1800s or the tech boom in the late 1990s, people get excited about putting money into the markets. Well, then, at some point, the bubble bursts and we have a recession. That means over 2 quarters. So between January to March or April to June, for example, those are both quarters, we see a reduction in the money going into the economy. If we see that we get into like 3 or 4 of those quarters and we're never getting out, holy crap, we're in a depression. And then finally, we get what we refer to as a recovery. Right now, we're in a recovery out of our last recession or depression, depending on who you talk to. Well, you hear on the news, we talk about double dip recessions. What's a double dip recession? You won't find this in your text, but I put it in here. That means imagine you were in a slippery hole in the ground. You've been digging your way out, and you slide back in just as you're seeing daylight. You had 2 quarters where the GDP turned positive again. You're growing. Your economy's doing well, and all of a sudden you slide back in. That's a double dip recession. What does it do? Just like nobody likes somebody who double dips a chip, nobody likes sliding back in the hole. It can discourage investors and make people feel pessimistic about the future. So that's what a double dip recession is. So right now, are we in a recession? We are recovering. There are some people who would say that we are in a recession or depression on top of a recovery, or vice versa. If you're in the white-collar industry right now, your savings have probably actually gotten bigger in the last year because you haven't been driving to work. If you're in the service economy, you may have a different view. So we've got a recession or depression on top of a recovery, depending what area you're working in. So the big I word, inflation, everybody seems to hate that word. Just like we hate that inflated balloon on top of this creepy clown, inflation is a word that makes people crazy. What is inflation? It's nothing that's unnatural. It just means prices go up over time. Why do prices go up over time? Because, well, people want raises. So if you're paying raises or raw materials get more expensive because the economy's doing well and there's high demand, you got to pass the price on to the consumer. Well, inflation is simply the price going up over time. Here's some related terms. Disinflation means the inflation rate is slowing down. You may say, well, that's good. That's a cause for celebration. Not necessarily. It could mean the economy is slowing down as well. If prices overall are going around, you got deflation. The air's coming out of the balloon. And then if you have stagflation, that means the economy's slowing, but prices are still going up. What the heck is happening here? Look at it this way. Let's say we're a car manufacturer, and because the economy's been slowing down, we started ceasing production, and we've got cars still on the lot, and the economy's slowing down, but suddenly the price of those cars is going up. Why is it? Well, because there are going to be fears that maybe cars won't be produced for a while, and right now somebody needs one. So that's stagflation. So there are two approaches to how people think inflation happens or how it does happen. There's cost push, which means that, hey, the price of materials and labor are going up, so more people are making homes, so the price of lumber is going up, and it's harder to get carpenters, so we're going to have to pay more. That's cost push rather. Demand pull means lots of people want stuff, and so that's making the price go up. In reality, it's probably a combination of both the increases of the cost of supplies and labor and the demand of consumer and scarcity of supply. So it all plays together, cost push versus demand pull. In the economic cycle as well, we also have different types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment means, for example, I'm leaving because I don't want to be in this job anymore. High levels of frictional unemployment actually are a good sign. Why is that? Well, if you've got frictional unemployment, if somebody's voluntarily leaving, it can mean they also believe that they would have the opportunity to get another job. So it could be a positive thing. If people think, hey, no problem getting another job, so I'm leaving, that level of confidence can mean the economy is strong. Structural could mean, for example, you're getting fired because of a slowdown. Things are just not good right now. The markets are slowing down. We got to get rid of you. Sorry. Cyclical means we overstaffed over time. For example, if we had, a time when home telephones were getting really popular again, and all of a sudden we hired all these people, but the market started correcting itself and more people started realizing they didn't need home phones anymore with their cell phones, that would be cyclical. Seasonal means, well, we hired you for Christmas. It's now January 4th. We don't need you anymore. That's seasonal. So before COVID, the unemployment rate was under 4%. That basically means full employment. That means anybody who wants a job can get one. What does the unemployment rate mean? It's not a straightforward number. People like to talk about the unemployment rate. Hey, we're back down to 6%, which was where we were as of the time of this recording. That's great, right? Well, it is great, but it's not the whole picture. Unemployment rate means the percentage of people who are actively trying to get a job who cannot get a job. It does not account for people who could be in the workforce who choose not to be, whether they have given up searching for jobs or just don't want to be part of the workforce. In reality, our labor force participation rate, which is the total number of people who could work, who choose to work, has never gotten really much beyond 80% in the last decades. So in reality, when the economy gets good and we get down to a 4% unemployment rate, we have to find ways to encourage other people to re-enter the workforce. So we talked about the business cycles and why we talk about full employment being like 4% and the differences in demand pull and cost push. Well, now we're going to be getting into what we refer to as monetary and fiscal policy. What are we talking about here? We're talking how the government allocates funding, spends, and makes strategy involving money. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy means we're deciding how we're taxing people. We're deciding how we're spending money. We're deciding how we are lowering the interest rates or raising them. We're deciding how much money gets to be in circulation. If you believe that you want to avoid inflation, you're going to have what we refer to as contractionary policy, and that means that we're reducing the amount of money in circulation to avoid inflation. So contractionary policy means, for example, you don't want to just start writing stimulus checks. You don't want to get people just getting mass amounts of cash to put into the economy, because that can also produce inflation. Now, expansionary policy means you're increasing the money in circulation, and that's exactly what we've done in the stimulus. So both of these policies have different goals. For example, if you have contractionary policy, if you're reducing the amount of money in circulation, you're trying to convince people to invest in bonds instead of the market. Bonds tend to be a more conservative investment that has guarantee over time. If you are, for example, doing contractionary policy, that means that you are not incentivizing people to invest in the market. If there's more money in circulation and you lower interest rates, more people will put money, for example, into the stock market instead. So contractionary policy, less money in circulation, less inflation. Expansionary, more money in circulation, potentially more inflation, but also the intent of getting us out of a particular economic crisis. We talk about the red and the black. The national deficit is meaning we're overspending. If you're in the red, it means you're in debt. So if you're overspending over time, you are in red, you are in debt. In basic business speak, anytime you're in the red, that means debt, and the black means breaking even or making money. We always want to be in the black. So how much we overspend versus the money we actually have, how much we live on credit, is our national deficit. Over time, that becomes the national debt, and we've got some significant national debt, trillions. Our national surplus is those really incredible times we actually are in the black. And the last time the United States government's been in the black was the year 2000. In fact, I'm going to encourage you to look up something called the U.S. National Debt Clock or Deficit Clock to see just how bad our national debt is. So we need to spend money that we don't have. How do we get it? We issue bonds. What does that mean? We borrow money from other countries. Right now, our top bondholders are Japan, China, and the UK, and those are 2020 numbers, but you can see we owe a lot of people a lot of money. So we talked about monetary and fiscal policy and why we're having troubles with national debt. What is the problem of a national debt? Well, at some point, people are going to say, you're a bad risk. A few years back, when we were in the throes of a recession, for example, we had the national debt at a point where our credit rating got degraded so that we were a higher risk than we had ever been as a country to borrow money. If you're a higher risk for borrowing money, what do? They raise your interest rate. And so, yeah, it can get complicated. We're going to be getting into our next section about supply and demand. And we've got two concepts we have to talk about, supply and demand. And whenever those end up reaching an equilibrium point, that means we've got enough supply to meet demand. Now, we're also going to be talking about how that equilibrium point is calculated and how we're able to be able to even out supply and demand, because the less supply you have, generally speaking, the price goes up because of supply and demand being out of balance. So what we have here on this diagram is what we refer to as a demand curve for in this example, we've got jackets for snowboarders. And this is based on the idea that we know in our industry at $100 a piece, we can sell about 600 jackets. So that is an example of a traditional demand curve. We know as a manufacturer, we know that our retailers have told us, yeah, if you charge $100, we can get rid of 600 jackets. Well, what happens if we produce a bunch of these jackets? We're going to say we're going to produce enough to satisfy demand for about 800 jackets. And we know that we can sell them. We're still in the right range at about $100 to move up to about 800 of these. So our supply curve, for example, if we were able to charge more, we could produce more of these jackets and we'd be ready to have them available. But a comfortable spot profit-wise for us is $100. Well, what happens, guys, the purpose of this diagram, that's a supply curve. Right in the middle, we have that supply and demand meet between $600 and $800. We got a comfortable range there. In fact, right at $700, we can sell them at $80 and move 700 of these jackets. If we reduce the price to $60, we can even sell more of these things. The problem is, from a supply and demand standpoint, if we start lowering our price too much, we might be cutting into our profit margins. However, if we raise the price, we're going to sell fewer jackets. So we have to decide what is going to be our comfortable spot for supply and demand, and where they meet at a place where we're selling a quantity that we want to be able to sell at a level of profit we're comfortable with, we meet what's called equilibrium point. Again, if you move to the left, it means things are slowing down. If you move to the left, you're selling less product. If you're moving to the left, you have more supply on hand that you're not getting rid of. If you move to the left, your economy is slowing down. Remember that term. Moving to the left means your economy is slowing down. So again, if we raise the price, we see a decrease in demand. If we move to the left, raising the price, we see a decrease in demand. We move to the right, we lower the price, we see an increase in demand. If you can understand that, you've got the basics of the economy. So what causes these curves to move one direction or the other? If people are making more money, we move to the right because we're willing to buy more things. If it's a hot item, we're moving to the right. People are buying more. If it's better tech that lowers the cost, we're moving to the right. If cost goes up, if people are unenthusiastic, if there's less disposable income, for example, we are moving to the left. If you have more suppliers, the curve moves to the right because you got more competition. It's better for the consumer. If you got fewer suppliers, you're moving to the left. So again, we're talking about the idea of market equilibrium, and market equilibrium is where supply and demand meet. Let's get into finally our discussion about market structures, and we're going to be talking about how these different types of structures work and the differences between oligopolies, monopolistic competitions, and monopolies. Guys, perfect competition means you've got plenty of people who are making a product or a service, and they have perfect competition because the consumer is able to pick between many different potential competing products with little intervention from government or from one firm having an advantage over anybody else. There's no such thing as perfect competition. I disagree with our text on this when he says there is no such thing as perfect competition. You get to a pure monopoly. That means one company produces a product or service and they have ultimate control over pricing. And there are a few monopolies out here. For example, in your area where you live, I'd be surprised if you have more than one supplier of natural gas. Monopolies often are things like utilities or internet service providers. You get monopolistic competition. It means you've got a lot of competitors, but the products ultimately are pretty similar. In monopolistic competition, Burger King and McDonald's both make very similar products. They make hamburgers on buns that are very similar, made of beef that's very similar, and they differentiate based on flavor or maybe even some production methodologies, but they're very similar. And then you've got oligopolies, which are companies that make a high-cost specialized product. There are a few competitors. Examples equal car companies and plane companies. So again, perfect competition. Our textbook says that farms are engaged in perfect competition. I think I would argue with that based on the idea of government intervention and regulation. Then you get into pure monopolies. Again, utilities and cable and internet are good examples. If you get into monopolistic competition, again, you're trying to make products that aren't really that fundamentally different, seem different, whether they're brands of clothing or whether they're hamburgers. Then you get into oligopolies, which are large markets with high barriers to entry. So in terms of market structure, what's different about these guys? It all determines on the number of competitors. It's determined by the number of competitors and what the barriers are to entry. Let's get in a little bit in terms of some of the other factors that are playing in the market. Right now, we've got 5 generations in the workforce. How is this complicating? Well, how do you make a product that appeals to people between the ages of about 16 and 90 years old? In addition, how do you have those folks communicate with each other when you've got folks who've never used a smartphone next to people who text for a living? So it can be very challenging. And in addition, we've got more older people who are continuing to work because they don't have health care or savings. Then we've got the developing world, which is coming at us hard and fast in the idea that a lot of these folks have great ideas, but lack capital or investment. And when you look at big economies like China and the United States, those are countries that are looking at ways how they can get involved in leveraging these economies, unfortunately sometimes exploiting people as well. Our demand for energy is almost limitless, but yet we're going to be running out of resources. And if you liked having a smartphone, you got a piece of Africa or China in your pocket too, because they are all powered by rare earth elements or minerals that power the batteries and processors and circuit boards of our phones. But there are very few of those elements available. So what's going to spell success in the new economy? Innovation is a big part of it. So guys, that is our first chapter. I thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you have a great day. I look forward to working with you.